Welcome, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to another Blender environment design tutorial. I am your fearless artist friend, Symmetry, and I'm here to guide you through the treacherous world of Blender. And today, in episode 4, we're going to be making a sunset lake, but this time we're going to be doing 2 separate scenes, and I ended up making 3 different shots as well. We're getting a little more advanced in this tutorial, and we'll be going over a few different add-ons. So in this add-on, I'll be using A.N.T landscape, I'll be using TrueVFX's TrueSky, and I use Botanique for my plants and rocks and whatnot. And I also add in a final detail using Southern Shoddy's VFX pack. Of course, you don't need all the paid add-ons if you don't want. You can always find free assets to download online, or you can purchase them if you can or if you want to. But it's not a requirement. You could also make these assets too if you want. It'll just take a little more time. In this tutorial though, I do use add-ons. The required one though is the A.N.T landscape add-on, which is built into Blender. You'll just have to make sure you go into your preferences and then add-ons and make sure that A.N.T landscape add-on is activated. I'm excited to be teaching you another environment design tutorial. They seem to be going pretty well on the channel. And be sure to like and subscribe down below. Leave some comments because I or the community can answer for you. And let me know what you want to see next in a Blender tutorial or what you want to see me 3D print next. So without further ado, let's make this relaxing sunset lake. Wow. Alright, let's get this tutorial started. Open up Blender and per usual, hit A to select all and delete. So first, Shift A, go to Mesh, and at the bottom select Landscape, and we'll make our first land piece. Open the A.N.T landscape menu at the bottom left if it doesn't open up automatically. Click on the preset drop down menu and select mounds. Change the mesh size to 8x8. Up the subdivisions to 256 by 256. Set the random seed to 15. But play around and find what you actually like and what you find visually appealing. And it'll be different for everyone depending on what references you use, or even if you're following along with me in this tutorial, make your environment personal to you and what you like. Next, I changed the noise size to 0.41, set the height to 0.14. Now if you're happy with your foreground piece, tab into edit mode. Hit 3 for face select, then press A to select all faces, press U to unwrap, and lastly right click and convert tris to quads. Go back to object mode and scale up the mesh to about 200 by 200 meters and Control A and apply the scale. Then I went into sculpt mode and smoothed out a walking path because this is going to be scene 1, which will be a path in a forest that will then lead into the sunset lake. Next, I went into edit mode and selected the faces along that path that I just smoothed out. Press O to toggle that proportional editing on, and with the faces selected along the smoothed out area, press G to grab the faces and bring them down just a bit. Now hop back into object mode and let's create some vertex groups for the grass, trees, leaves, and rocks. Because now we're going to be going into weight paint and making our weight paint maps for our particle systems. So now that we're in weight paint mode, you can play around with the brush settings and add a lot of jitter or add just a little bit. I go back and forth between adding weights and erasing them and switching the jitter settings and just playing around with getting a more organic weight map. And to erase weights, you just have to switch your weight of the brush to 0, and when you want to add more weight, just switch that weight to 1. Use your reference to create the aspects that you enjoy and what seems realistic to you. Since we made the vertex groups for all the different layers for this environment, I just weight painted how I felt where the trees should go, where the grass should be, where bushes should be. And once I'm done, then I added in a camera to start working with what the camera shot will look like, and I can test render and all that. When you add in your camera, change the focal length to 30 millimeter and your resolution to 2560 by 1080 to create this epic wide shot look. Now that we have a foreground piece, let's add in the midground piece. And when you add in another landscape piece, the A.N.T landscape add-on will save the settings of the previous piece that you just made. So for the midground, I just adjusted the mesh size to 8 by 12. Scale up the mesh to about 146 by 200 millimeters and place it behind the foreground piece. Once you have that placed, go into edit mode and again, tries to quads, select all the faces, and unwrap again. Also make sure you Control A and apply the scale for that piece as well. I again also use proportional editing to adjust this midground mesh and to look more organic and be able to hide the edges a little bit. So I go back to the foreground piece to finish weight paints for our vertex groups. Remember, you will only need particles in the areas that are in the camera view. You don't need particles covering the entire landscape because that will just add more computer power and your render will be slower if you have a ton of particles that aren't even going to be seen when you go to render. As you can see, for the midground piece, I only weight painted the front half of the mesh, and that's because you wouldn't see the back of that midground piece when we go to render. Now that all of our weight paints are done, our vertex groups are set, our land pieces have applied scales, we can now collect trees, rocks, grass, bushes, and any other environmental elements that we want to add in. I use a mixture of collecting things from online. I use Blender Kit a lot, and I'm using the add-on Botanique. It's one of my favorite add-ons for plants, trees, and rocks. It's really great, and I do recommend Botanique. Collect a variety of trees and plants and put them off to the side out of the camera view. That way we can just group them and reference them in our particle system. If you're using Botanique, make sure that when you add in objects, you then convert them to editable to be used in the particle system. I then create another vertex group for the walking path. So weight paint that walking path, and we can now create a vertex paint from the weight paint. And to do that, make sure the vertex group for the walking path is selected and go into vertex paint. Click the paint menu at the top and select vertex from weight paint. This will convert the weight paint that we made for the walking path into a vertex color. And when you do this, there will be a new attribute group in the attributes window. Rename it walking path. And now for my environment, I wanted to make sure there were leaves scattered across the ground and the walking path. So you could either make leaf models or you can download a set. I found a set for free on CG Trader, and it's a really nice and high quality set. Like, the shaders are highly detailed, the shapes of the leaves are very organic. Now let's find some other shaders for the environment to get some color. I started with a PBR forest leaves dirt from Blender Kit. Then I downloaded Ground 78 from Ambient CG. Open up the shader editor window and duplicate the principal BSDF and hit Control-Shift-T to upload the Ground 78 shader that we downloaded. Hold Shift, right-click, and drag over the two principal BSDFs to mix the two shaders. Then play around with both shaders' scale and rotation to create an appropriate sizing for our scene. Make sure you're looking through the camera view as well. And to make this mix of shaders more organic and realistic, we can add in a noise texture to the factor of the mix shader. And with the noise texture selected, you could hit Control T to map it to our land piece. Add a color ramp between the noise texture and the mix shader to increase the contrast of the noise texture. And the way the noise texture looks is how the two shaders will be blended. I changed the scale of the noise texture to 0.62, the detail to 0.9, and I changed the mapping scale to 0.64. I also changed the rotation of the Z on the mapping of the noise texture to 40.2 degrees. Now duplicate the principal BSDF again, and let's add in another texture. This next shader will be the walking path, so I used a forest gravel that I believe I got from Blender Kit. Hold shift, right click, and drag over the principal BSDF with the mix shader to mix the mix shader with this new texture. Add an attribute node to the add an attribute node and plug that into the factor of the new mix shader, and type in walking path exactly how you named the attribute. You should now be seeing a great mix of these different ground shaders and then a clear difference between that and our walking path texture. Now that we have this foreground piece shaded and there's some color on it and it's all mixed up, we can get into the particle systems, and we'll start with the grass system first. Add a new particle system, name the system and the settings grass.001, make it a hair system, check the box that says advanced, and also check the box for rotation. Go to render and render it as a collection and select our grass collection. Check the boxes object rotation and pick random. In the vertex groups tab, select the density and make that our grass weight paint. Change the orientation in the rotation tab to object Y, and then give the system interpolated children. The final settings for my grass particle system, starting from the top, is the number is set to 2000, rotation orientation is set to object Y, and randomized rotation is set to 0.137. Randomized phase is 0.025. It is rendered as my grass collection. The render scale is 0.2, and the scale randomness is 0.139. The interpolated children is set to render amount 10, and obviously I'm using our grass weight paint for the density. We will then repeat this process for our trees, bushes, leaves, and anything else that you want to add to this foreground piece. And for the midground, I added a trees and grass particle system, so you'll need to make the weight maps for those and the vertex groups for those too. As the video is playing, I'll just say my final particle system setting values for each system, but play around with your particle systems, or you can copy my settings if you want to. The key to most art is to create what makes you happy and enjoy. So I recommend playing around and experimenting when it comes to making anything in Blender. For the foreground trees, starting from the top, number equals 750. Rotation is object Y, randomize and phase is 0. It's rendered as my tree collection. The render scale is 0.971. Scale randomness is 0.433. I don't have any children with this particle system, and the density is set to my tree's weight map. You can also duplicate a particle system setting, or you can start fresh by just creating a new particle system. But always make sure that you name it appropriately, and so you don't lose track of what is what when it comes to the particle system settings. For the foreground bushes, number is set to 300. Rotation is object Y. Randomize in the phase is 0. It is rendered as my bush collection. Scale is equal to 1.440. Scale randomness is 0.599. No children for this particle system, and the density is my bush's weight map. The foreground leaves particle system, the number is 3000. Rotation is object Y, randomizes 0.013. It is rendered as my leaves collection. Scale equals 0.519. Scale randomness equals 0.540. Interpolated children for the display amount is 10, and the render amount is 100. The density is set to my leaves weight map. And if you don't know how to bring in a Blender file that you've downloaded online, all you need to do is go to File and then Append. So append the leaves file wherever you downloaded it, and you should be able to start editing, duplicating, and use that new collection of leaves in your scene as well. My midground trees particle system is set to number equals 300. Rotation is object Y. Randomize is 0. It is rendered as my tree collection. The scale for the midground particle system for trees is 1.261. Scale randomness is 0.572. No children, and the density is set to the tree's weight map for the midground. The midground grass particle system is number equals 2000. Rotation is object Y. Randomize is 0.137. The phase for the rotation is 0.025. Render as the grass collection. Render scale equals 0.454. Scale randomness equals 0.139. No children for this particle system, and the density map is the midground grass weight map. Now everything in scene 1 has a shader and a particle system. We need to add a sky, and I use TrueVFX's TrueSky add-on. It's another favorite. But you can also use a high quality sky image and a sun lamp for this. The sky settings I used in the TrueSky add-on was the sun size equals 3.58 degrees, intensity is 1, height equals 16.20 degrees, rotation is 103.3 degrees, sky strength is 1. Everything's looking beautiful in scene 1, and now we can start animating our camera. Before we start animating, we need to adjust the focal distance in our depth of field settings for the camera. So select your camera and go to the settings for it. In the depth of field, change our focal distance to between 5 and 7.5 meters. I also parented the camera to an empty. And to do that, all you need to do is Shift A, add an empty, and then Shift select the camera and press Ctrl C to copy the camera's location and rotation. I then parented the camera to the empty. This helps create a smoother camera movement instead of adding both location and rotation keyframes to the camera itself. So now you'll be able to animate the camera's location using the empty and animate the camera's rotation using the camera itself. For this first scene, I made a smooth camera movement through the scene near the ground floor so you can see all the leaves that are scattered across the ground and the walking path. and then added a slight rotation up. That's all for scene 1, so now let's move on to scene 2, which we'll be doing 2 different shots in that one. So in scene 2, our shot 1 will be the camera coming through the trees and seeing this beautiful lake at sunset. And shot 2 will start at the bottom of this bench near the lake and rise up to the top of the bench overlooking the lake. To start scene 2, we can duplicate the scene and delete all the objects in there, except for our particle collections. So once your new scene is empty, hit Shift A and add a new A.N.T landscape piece. I started with the lake preset, and these are the settings I used for this piece. Subdivisions are 256 by 256. Mesh size is 2 by 2. Seed was 20. The noise size was 0.85. And I left the rest of the settings from the preset for this one. Now scale the lake piece up 111. Dimensions were roughly 222 by 222 meters. Then go into edit mode. Make sure face select is on and select all faces, tries to quads, and hit U to unwrap. And then go back to object mode and apply the scale. Then I selected some of the areas around the lake using the proportional editing in edit mode, and I raised these areas just slightly. Now we can make a land piece that will lead up to the lake, and we'll duplicate this piece to go around the lake as well. The settings for this A.N.T landscape piece is the preset is mounds, subdivisions is 256 by 256, mesh size is 8 by 8, the seed is 5, noise size 0.33, and then scale it up about 33.5, roughly around 268 by 268 meters. And then make sure you apply the scale. Go into edit mode, select all faces, tries to quads, and use U to unwrap. For this piece I also went into sculpt mode and smoothed out the edge closest to the lake. Then in edit mode I would select one face at a time and use proportional editing to blend and hide the edges and give my land piece a little more of an organic look. With these 2 land pieces now placed, I move the camera to find a good shot to start working with. I duplicated the land piece leading into the lake, and in edit mode I adjusted the land to fit the right and left side of the lake, and then I duplicated it one more time to go behind the lake, and I stretched that one out on the y-axis to fit across the scene. Try to hide the edges the best you can for the land pieces surrounding the lake, but we'll be also adding particle systems, and those edges will be even more hidden once those particle systems are made. Now I think to pull the whole scene together, a couple mountains would look great in the background, so let's add those in. For the mountains, I added another A.N.T landscape piece with the preset Mountain 1. And then these are the settings I adjusted. Subdivisions is 126 by 126. Mesh size is a 6 by 6. The seed is 140. Noise size 1. And then scale it up 178, or dimensions roughly around 1070 by 1070 meters, and apply scale. Place the mountains in the back behind all the other land pieces and find a visually pleasing place for them. Then make another mountain using the same process, but change the seed so it's more unique and doesn't look like 2 exact looking mountains. Scale that one up and apply the scale, and then place it in the back as well. In edit mode for both of these mountains, make sure to select all the faces, change the faces from tries to quads, and use U to unwrap. I also recommend having fun adjusting these pieces and the settings when you're making landscape pieces, and make them to how you actually want the scene to look. We can also get the slope weight maps for each mountain And to do that, click the Create tab on the right hand side and the Landscape Tools and select Slope from Weight. We'll be using these weight maps for blending shaders. And speaking of shaders, I think it's about time we add some. I reused the foreground land shader from scene 1 and removed the walking path section of that shader. And I just adjusted everything a little bit to make it more unique and not exactly identical to scene 1. You can apply this newly edited shader to all the other land pieces that are around the lake, except for the mountains and the lake land piece itself. For that lake land piece, we're going to duplicate the foreground land shader. So add the foreground land shader to it and then hit the duplicate button. And replace one of the ground shaders with ground 12 from ambient CG. And replace the other one with ground 78. You can also get the slope weight map of the lakeland piece, then paint more weight into the areas where the water will be. And then for the lake land piece, I blended ground 15 shader and used the weight map that we just created. I'll show screenshots of my shader after I explain how I made it, so don't worry about following along too closely. I just want to explain how we get to where we ended. So the first shader is ground 73. The mapping scale is 25.8. This is mixed with shader ground 78, and the mapping scale for that one is 20.7. In the mix shader, I have a noise texture in the factor. The noise texture scale is 0.63, detail is 3, roughness is 1, and in the mapping scale for the noise texture is 10.94. And I rotated it on the z-axis 40.2 degrees. The noise texture is plugged into a color ramp to increase contrast of the noise texture. So for the lake floor, I wanted to make it a mixture of mud and rocks. So I used gravel 15 from ambient CG. The mapping scale for that one is 31.4, and I mixed it with shader ground 12. And the mapping for ground 12 is 4.3. There's another noise texture similar to the last one plugged into the factor of this mix shader. The scale for this noise texture is 0.45, and the mapping scale is adjusted to 5.94. Now mix the two mix shader nodes, and for the factor on this one, we will add in a attribute node and type in slope. Add a color ramp and an invert color between the attribute node and the mix shader factor. Now using TrueSky, let's create that sunset. I adjusted the sky and sun settings for this one. The sun size is 1.75 degrees, intensity is 1.84, height equals 6.16 degrees, rotation is negative 86.8 degrees. The sky strength is 0.7, and then I enabled the clouds and made them the stratocumulus clouds. Now we can move on to the mountains and add some shaders to these, and we'll be done with shaders. Click on one of the mountains and create a new material. With the Principled BSDF selected, press Ctrl-Shift-T and add Rock 28 from Ambient CG. Make the mapping scale 8, duplicate the Principled BSDF node, and hit Ctrl-Shift-T again and add in Rock 48. Adjust the mapping for that shader to a scale of 6.5. Then mix the two shaders together and plug in another noise texture and color ramp into the factor. With the noise texture selected, you can press Ctrl-T to map it. For the mapping scale on this one, I adjusted each axis. So from top to bottom, it is 1.08, 3.18, and 0.28. Adjust the noise texture scale to 10, detail of 15, roughness of 0.108, and increase the contrast using that color ramp. I think this sunset lake is starting to look pretty awesome. Let's create vertex groups for our trees, grass, rocks, and bushes, just like we did in scene 1, and we can start creating those weight maps. I use the same method as scene 1, going back and forth between adding weights and erasing weights, and messing around with the jitter that's on the brush. Add weights to where you would like to see the trees, the grass, and the rocks, and make the maps have no weights to where you would want clearings in the environment where there's no trees, and in areas that aren't in the camera view. Again, just like scene 1, we kind of go through the same process for these particle systems, so I'll just list out the settings I used for each particle system if you're following along. So for the foreground trees, we should still have the settings of the foreground trees particle system from scene 1, and you can duplicate that and rename it accordingly, or you can start from a new system and just start from scratch. So for the foreground trees, it is a advanced hair system. Check the box for rotation. The number is set to 300. Rotation is object Y. Phase equals 0. Render it as the tree collection. Pick random and use object rotation. Render scale is 1.419 and scale randomness is 0.219. There's no children in this particle system, and the density is set to our tree's weight map. Let's add in the grass now. It is also an advanced hair system. Check that box for rotation. Number is set to 2000. Rotation is object Y. Randomize is 0.137. Random phase is 0.025. Render as our grass collection. Scale for the render is 0.51. Scale randomness is 0.439. I added interpolated children, and the display amount I set was 25 and our render amount as 75. And then the density, of course, is going to be our grass weight map. Now let's add in the bushes. Also a advanced tree system, number set to 300. Rotation is object Y. Render as our bush collection, and the render scale is 1.44. Randomness is 0.599. No children in this particle system, and the density is the bush's weight map. The last particle system I added for our foreground is the rocks. It is another advanced hair system, number set to 2000. Rotation is set to object Y. Randomize is 0.37. Random phase is 0.25. Rendered as our rock collection with the scale set to 0.41 and randomness set to 0.610. I added interpolated children, and the display and render amount I set was 20, and we're using the rocks weight map for the density. Next, I'll go over one of the midground particle systems, but this is where I recommend you play around with particle systems and learn it by actually doing. Now I'll go over the lakeland piece particle systems, and we need to just make sure that we apply weight maps for all the different layers of particles that we want to add to this environment. But make sure you just don't add weights to the areas where water will be, because we won't be seeing that in the camera. Once you have your weight maps for the lake land piece, you can follow along or adjust the particle systems to whatever layers you decided to add in. So for mine, I made a trees, bushes, and grass particle system. For the trees, I made the number 20. Rotation is object Y. Rendering as our tree collection. The scale is 1.589. The randomness is 0.219. No children for this tree particle system, and the density is the tree's weight map. For bushes, I set the number to 150. Rotation is object Y. Render as our bushes collection. Render scale is 2.01. Randomness is 0.599. No children for this particle system, and using the bushes weight map for the density. Last particle system for this midground piece is the grass, and the number is set to 2000. Rotation is object Y with a randomize of 0.137. render as our grass collection. Render scale is 0.76. Randomness is 0.439. I added interpolated children for the grass, and the display amount is 20 and the render amount is 75. To wrap up this particle system, just make sure you use the grass weight map for the density. You can apply similar particle systems to the other land pieces, but just always make sure that you're duplicating particle settings, because if not, you'll be editing the particle systems that are using the same settings. And I recommend just adjusting scale, rotation, the number of particles that are in the system, and add variation to make it look more real and a more organic look. With particle systems done now, we can add in the water for our lake. Make the water plane visible again and select it, go into edit mode, select the face and right click subdivide with 100 cuts. Go back into object mode and press Ctrl 2 and apply that level 2 subdivision. Hop back into edit mode and select all the faces and press E to extrude down. Then Control R on the side of our now water cube and add in 16 loop cuts around the water. We'll come back to our water object to add shaders in just a bit. I now use Blender Kit to find a big log to put into the foreground, and I found some boulders and large rocks to put them throughout our scene. Once I placed these extra details into our scene, I went back to our water cube to add in the shader. So make sure you have the cube selected and open up the shader editor again and add a new material. Name the material lakewater.001. Change the base color to a dark grayish purple. Set the metallic to 9.09. Roughness is 0. I changed the IOR to 1.333 because that is the IOR of actual water. Then I plugged in a Fresnel node to the alpha and set the IOR for the Fresnel to 1.33 as well. Plug in a noise texture to the normal and add a bump node in between. Make sure the noise texture is in the height of the bump node, then plug in an ambient occlusion node into the strength of the bump. On the ambient occlusion node, change the strength to 16 and the distance to 500, and add a color ramp and an RGB curves node in between that. Bring the black on the color ramp up, and on the curves node, take the right point and drag it down to the middle of that last quadrant near the bottom. Now add in a principal volume shader and a volume absorption shader. Mix those two and plug the mix shader into the volume of the material output. Copy the blue color from the principal BSDF and add it to the principal volume color, and then just lighten it up. Copy that light blue color now into the volume absorption color. Change the density of the volume absorption to 0.5 and the factor of the mix shader to 0.8. Go back to the noise texture and change the scale to 500 and make the noise 4D. And in that W section of the noise texture, that's where we will animate. I'm using 300 frames for my render. So I have the W go from 0 to 0.001, and that is from frames 0 to 304. For animating environments, you don't really want to put keyframes on the very last frame that's going to be rendered because you want the continuous motion. So that's why I went 4 frames ahead. As we continue through this environment tutorial, make sure you're constantly test rendering and making sure everything's looking good to what you like. I also used BlenderKit to find this nice park bench to include in our scene, and I placed it to where as if it was a real place and you sat on the bench, you would be looking over the lake. Now for a final touch on this scene, I used Southern Shoddy's dynamic VFX pack and added a group of birds flying through the scene. Southern Shoddy's dynamic VFX pack is another great add-on, and I would recommend buying it because there's so many different things you can be adding into scenes for characters. There's just a lot that you can go through with that add-on. If you are using this add-on with me, my settings for the flock are count is 200, bird size minimum is 0.351, and the max size is 1.325. Starting position is -5 for the minimum, and for the maximum is -1. Flocking spin amount is 0.971, and noise amount is 5.25. And before I end up rendering and setting my computer for a whole day to render, I always make sure I'm test rendering the scene to make sure everything's looking great. Now that I'm happy with how everything looks, we can animate the camera to go through the trees and approach the bench overlooking the lake. I added a camera shakeify to the camera. I used the wedding preset. I adjusted the influence to 0.75 and the scale to 1.56. And these are my render settings for my scenes. Render samples is 128. I use the open image denoiser. I make sure I'm using my GPU for rendering. I added a motion blur of 0.5, and in the performance tab, changed the tile size to 512. I changed the color management to medium high contrast, and then I make sure that I will be rendering out to the appropriate folder. Now with all of our scenes rendered out, this part is optional, but it is a very good skill and tool to know about. When your scene is done rendering, you can open up a new Blender file and use the Compositing workspace to add more contrast, blur, glare, and you can even change the color hue of your scene, and there's just so much more you can do with compositing. So when you open up your new Blender file, make sure to select all and delete the camera, cube, and light, and then open up the Compositing workspace. Check the box Use Nodes and delete the Render Layer node. Add in an image sequence node and select all the frames from scene 1. Add a viewer node and plug in the image sequence to that. You can now click the View tab on the right and click Fit, and then adjust the scale and position to how you would like the view to look as you're compositing. Hit Shift A and add a RGB curves node. Add a middle point and bring the point down just a little bit. Next, add a mix color node and change it to overlay. Add image. Add an image node and select a vignette for the image. Change the overlay factor to 0.3. You can duplicate the vignette and add another RGB curves node and plug that second vignette into the factor of the RGB curve. Then in between the nodes, add an invert color. I added 2 points to the curves node and adjusted the points to what I found visually appealing. Now the last 2 nodes that we'll be adding into our composite at the end is a glare node and a lens distortion node. For the glare, change the type to fog glow, adjust the threshold to 0.5 and the size to 9. For the lens distortion, check Fit, change the dispersion to 0.01. Now we're ready to render out this newly composited scene for scene 1. But make sure you change the resolution to match our scene, which is 2560 by 1080. And now in the rest of this video, I use roughly the same nodes for scene 2 and scene 3. But I just adjusted the RGB curves nodes and made sure that everything was kind of matching the same lighting and look of scene 1. That way everything looks like it belongs to the same world and the same environment. Okay, This has to be probably one of my best environment designs that I've had yet, and the render just looks chef's kiss, beautiful. I hope you learned a lot in this tutorial, and I hope it was helpful, taught you some few techniques and skills, showed you how powerful some add-ons can be. Be sure to like and subscribe down below and leave a comment of what you thought about this tutorial. Where did you get stuck at? What did you enjoy the most? What would you like to see in the next tutorial? And I also 3D print, so give me some recommendations on things you'd like to see 3D printed. Characters, different types of designs. But I hope you really enjoyed it and you learned a lot. I love teaching this stuff. I love being creative, especially with all of you. I would love to see your artwork as well, so post your stuff and comment me, at me. And until next time, stay creative and stay safe out there. Peace.